It was a late evening when James, a well-dressed black man, drove down a quiet street in the city. He was on his way home from an important business meeting, his mind still busy with the discussions he'd had about the new project he was about to take on. He had no idea that this night would change everything for him. As he drove, the headlights of a police car suddenly flashed behind him. He felt his heart race a little. He wasn't speeding, and he knew his papers were in order. But there was something about being pulled over by the police that always made him nervous. He slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, waiting for the officer to approach. A young white officer, Officer Collins, stepped out of the car, and another officer, Officer Richards, followed closely behind. They both wore the usual uniforms, their expressions serious but calm. James smiled politely and rolled down his window. "Good evening, sir. I need to ask you a few questions," Officer Collins said, his tone formal. James raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Sure, officer. What's the matter?" "We're conducting a routine check. We just need to search your vehicle to make sure everything's in order." Collins didn't ask. He just stated it. James felt uneasy. Something felt off. He had done nothing wrong. But he also knew that some police officers were known for taking advantage of situations like this. Still, he didn't want to make things more complicated. He nodded again and said, "All right, go ahead." The officers began to search his car, checking under the seats and even in the glove compartment. James tried to remain calm, reminding himself that he was doing everything by the book. As Officer Collins went through the glove compartment, something unexpected happened. He pulled out a large bundle of cash. James looked at the money, confused. It wasn't his. He hadn't seen it before. Officer Collins, with a quick glance at Officer Richards, smiled slyly. "What's this? You carrying a lot of cash tonight, huh?" James shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know what that is. It must be some kind of mistake." But Officer Collins wasn't convinced. He glanced over at his partner, and they exchanged a brief, knowing look. "It's not really a mistake," Officer Richards muttered, stepping closer. "Let's just keep this between us, okay? It's a lot of money, and we don't want to make a big deal of it." Before James could respond, Officer Collins stuffed the money into his uniform pocket, as though it had always belonged to him. "You're free to go," Collins said, giving James a quick, dismissive nod. "But next time, make sure everything is in order." James sat there, stunned. He didn't know what had just happened. He knew they had taken his money, but there was nothing he could do in that moment. He couldn't risk making a scene, not with the officers having all the power in that situation. As the police car drove off into the night, James sat in his car for a few moments, taking deep breaths. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. How could two officers just take money from him without any explanation? But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he had no idea how this incident would come back to him, or just how connected the officers were to his future. He pulled out onto the road again, still trying to process what had just happened. Little did he know, his life was about to change forever. The next morning, James couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had spent most of the night thinking about what happened during his encounter with the police officers. The way they had stolen his money made him feel small, powerless. He had always trusted law enforcement to be fair, but that night had opened his eyes to a different reality. The worst part was, he had no way of proving what they did. As he sat at his desk in his apartment, James tried to focus on his work. He had a lot to do, especially with the upcoming launch of his new business venture. He couldn't afford to let this situation distract him for too long. But the nagging thoughts wouldn't leave him alone. Meanwhile, the two officers, Collins and Richards, were celebrating their unexpected windfall. They sat in a small diner, chatting over coffee. The stolen money was safely hidden in their lockers, waiting to be spent. They were both smiling, thinking they had pulled off a smooth move without anyone noticing. "You think he'll come back for it?" Officer Richards asked, his voice low as he took a sip of his coffee. "No," Collins replied with confidence. He didn't seem like the type, probably scared to do anything. But we got ourselves a nice little bonus, huh? Richards grinned, feeling a rush of excitement. It's just a little extra cash, nothing serious. The two officers laughed, unaware that their actions would soon come back to haunt them. Back in his apartment, James tried to push the incident out of his mind, but the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. He had worked hard for everything he had. To have someone take what was rightfully his without any consequences was frustrating. He knew he should have done something that night, but it was too late now. Or was it? James spent the next few days carefully looking into his options. He wasn't the type to sit back and let something go, especially not when he knew he had been wronged. He considered his choices, from filing a complaint with the police department to going through legal channels. But there was something inside him telling him to wait. Something bigger was at play. Then the phone rang. James picked up the receiver, expecting another call about his business project. But the voice on the other end of the line made his heart stop. "Mr. James, this is the mayor's office. We've reviewed your resume, and we're pleased to inform you that you've been selected for a very important position in the city's law enforcement department. We'll be sending you an official letter soon with all the details. Congratulations." The words hit James like a wave. The law enforcement department. What did they want with him? He had no background in police work, and he never imagined he'd be involved in anything related to it. He had worked hard in his business career, and now the city wanted him to join the police force. Confused, James sat back in his chair, the phone still in his hand. He knew that the officers who had stolen from him worked in the very department the mayor's office was referring to. And now, here he was, about to become part of that very system. The next chapter of his life was unfolding before him, but it wasn't clear yet how it would all tie together. James set the phone down, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity running through his mind. His path was about to change, and he had no idea what would come next. But one thing was certain. He would make sure the officers who stole from him would not go unpunished. James sat at his desk, the phone call from the mayor's office still echoing in his mind. The city's law enforcement department wanted him. It was a big offer, and the excitement of it was hard to ignore. But in the back of his mind, a different thought kept creeping in. Could this be connected to the two officers who took my money? He sat there, staring at the letter that arrived that morning, confirming the position. The job was higher up than he expected, an advisory role, helping with oversight and reform within the department. It sounded like the kind of challenge he was ready to take on, but there was a catch. He had no experience in law enforcement. His business background was impressive, but this was something new. James had always been someone who believed in fairness and justice. He wasn't the type to let wrongdoing slide, especially after what had happened to him. He had spent days trying to figure out how he could get back at the officers who took his money, but now things were different. He had a chance to do something bigger, something that would bring real change. Still, the officers, Collins and Richards, kept running through his mind. They had stolen from him, and now they were still out there, wearing badges. James knew that the only way he could make things right was to get into a position where he could have real influence. If he took this job, he might have a chance to stop them from hurting anyone else. He made up his mind quickly. He accepted the position. The next few weeks passed in a blur as James adjusted to his new role. He attended meetings, reviewed case files, and worked closely with the department's leadership team. Everyone treated him with respect, and it was clear that they thought he would be a great addition to the team. But what they didn't know was that James wasn't just there to offer advice on improving operations. He had another goal in mind. He was going to find a way to hold the two officers accountable. One afternoon, as James sat in his office reading through a file, there was a knock on the door. He looked up to see the faces of Officer Collins and Officer Richards, the two men who had stolen from him. They were standing at the door, their faces neutral, but James could see the surprise in their eyes when they saw him sitting behind the desk. "Well, well," Collins said with a forced smile. "It looks like the city's new guy is here already. Congratulations on the promotion." James stood up slowly, his heart racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The two officers who had once stolen from him were now standing in front of him, not knowing who he really was. "Thank you, Officer Collins," James said calmly. "I'm sure we'll work closely together moving forward." Richards gave a nervous chuckle, unaware of James' knowledge of their previous actions. "We'll be around. Just wanted to say hello." As the officers left the office, James felt a sense of satisfaction. He had made it to a place where he could finally confront them. They had no idea that he knew what they had done. And now he was in a position of power, a position where he could finally make them answer for their mistake. It was all starting to fall into place. James sat back in his chair, a quiet smile spreading across his face. He was ready. The real work was about to begin. James was adjusting to his new role in the law enforcement department. It wasn't easy at first. There were so many things to learn, and so many people to meet, but James knew why he was there. He wasn't just there to give advice. He was there to make a difference. The officers and staff in the department treated him with respect. They respected his business experience, and they were hopeful that he would bring fresh ideas. He spent his days working on various projects to improve how the department operated, looking for ways to make it more efficient, fair, and transparent. But there was one thing James couldn't stop thinking about: Collins and Richards. The two officers who had stolen from him were still out there, working their usual shifts. They probably thought the whole thing was over, that they had gotten away with it. James wasn't going to let them get away with it. He had a plan, but it was going to take time. James began to observe the department from the inside, making careful notes about how things worked and how the officers were performing. He wanted to understand who could be trusted and who was acting dishonestly. Over the next few weeks, he gathered evidence, slowly piecing together information that would allow him to confront the two officers without making any mistakes. One morning, after a long meeting, James walked through the department hallways. As he passed by various offices, he heard bits of conversation about the work the officers were doing. There were some good reports, and then there were others that were questionable. It seemed like Collins and Richards were good at covering their tracks, but James had an eye for detail. As he passed by a conference room, James saw the two officers sitting inside, talking with another officer. They looked up as he entered the room, and their faces instantly changed. The look of surprise and uncertainty in their eyes didn't escape James. He knew they hadn't expected him to be in such a position of power. They had no idea what he was planning. "Good morning, officers," James said, walking into the room with a calm and confident air. "How's everything going today?" Collins smiled, though it seemed forced. "Everything's fine, sir. We were just going over some reports." "Good," James replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Keep up the good work." He paused, watching them closely. There was something in their eyes, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. They had to know that things were about to change. As James left the room, he couldn't help but smile to himself. He had them right where he wanted them. They didn't know it yet, but they were on borrowed time. He was now in control, and he was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. The power had shifted. James wasn't just an outsider looking in anymore. He had become part of the department, and now he was in a position to make things right. The next few days were a blur as James continued his work, keeping his plan in the back of his mind. He couldn't rush things. He had to be careful. Every step had to be calculated. He knew that once he confronted the officers, there would be no turning back. But for now, he kept his focus on his job, waiting for the right moment to make his move. James sat in his office, looking out the window, feeling the weight of what was to come. He had the power now, and he was going to use it to make sure justice was done. James had been in his new role for a few weeks now, and things were starting to fall into place. He had been watching Collins and Richards closely, gathering information, and making careful observations. He knew that the time to confront them was coming soon, but he wasn't rushing. He had learned that patience was key. One morning, James was reviewing some reports in his office when a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Collins and Richards standing in the doorway, both of them with their usual calm expressions. James had dealt with them long enough to know that they were trying to mask their nervousness. "Good morning, sir," Collins said with a tight smile. "We wanted to check in with you about the upcoming department meeting." James stood up, his mind racing. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He couldn't let them off easy. He had the power now, and it was time to use it. "Come in, officers," James said, his voice steady. "I'll be happy to discuss the meeting." Collins and Richards stepped inside, and James motioned for them to sit down. The air in the room felt thick with tension. James could see the way they were both trying to maintain their composure, but it was obvious they were on edge. They had no idea that James knew the truth about what they had done. "I've been reviewing some of your reports," James began, his voice calm but firm. "And I've noticed a few things that need to be addressed." Collins shifted in his seat. "What kind of things, sir?" James paused for a moment, his gaze locked on the officers. "I'm not just talking about the reports. I'm talking about what happened a few weeks ago. The night you stopped me on the road and took something that didn't belong to you." The color drained from both officers' faces. James could see their shock, and for the first time, they didn't seem as confident as they usually did. What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, trying to hide his nervousness behind a smile. James leaned forward, his eyes never leaving theirs. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The money you took from my car. I've been watching you too closely since I started here, and I've gathered all the evidence I need." There was a long pause as the two officers exchanged uneasy glances. They seemed to realize that James wasn't going to let this go. He could see the fear starting to creep in. You can't prove anything," Collins finally said, his voice shaking. "It's just your word against ours." James stood up from his desk and walked over to the window, his back to them. "I don't need just my word. I have everything I need. You may have thought you could get away with it, but now you're going to face the consequences." There was a silence in the room. The officers seemed to be processing what James had said. James knew that they were trying to figure out what to do next, but it was too late. The truth was out, and they couldn't escape it. Finally, Collins spoke again, his voice low. "What are you going to do?" James turned around, facing them once more. He didn't have to say much. "I'll make sure you both face the consequences of your actions. You don't get to steal from someone and get away with it. Not in my department." Collins and Richard sat there, defeated. They knew they had been caught, and there was no way out. James felt a sense of satisfaction. He had done what he set out to do. He had confronted them, and now they would have to answer for their mistake. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about doing what was right. After the confrontation, James felt a sense of relief. He had confronted Collins and Richards, but that was only the beginning. Now he needed to make sure they were held accountable for their actions. He knew that taking them down wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to make sure justice was served. The following days were filled with meetings, reports, and paperwork, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done about the two officers. He had already started gathering evidence, but he needed more. He needed proof that they were involved in other dishonest activities within the department, something that would strengthen his case. James decided to start by quietly speaking with some of the officers who worked closely with Collins and Richards. He didn't want to alarm anyone, so he kept his questions casual, asking about the officers' work habits and whether they had seen anything suspicious. At first, no one seemed willing to talk, but James was persistent. He asked a few more questions here and there, being careful not to raise suspicion. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. One officer, a veteran named Officer Davis, mentioned that Collins and Richards often worked together on the night shifts. They always seem to have a little extra money on them after their shifts, Officer Davis said, his voice low. Never really asked any questions about it, but I've heard things. They've always been a bit too cozy with each other. James knew this was a start. He thanked Officer Davis and moved on, keeping his observations to himself for the time being. It was clear that Collins and Richards weren't as careful as they thought. There were others who had noticed their odd behavior, and James was going to use that to his advantage. The next step was to go through the department's financial records. If Collins and Richards were stealing money from people, they might have been using their positions to cover up other illegal activities. James spent hours combing through reports, looking for discrepancies, and finally, he found something. There was a pattern. The two officers had made several unauthorized stops over the past few months. While some of the reports seemed legitimate, others were far too vague or incomplete. James knew these were the moments when the officers had taken advantage of their power. They had used their authority to pull over drivers, looking for an opportunity to steal. James felt a mix of anger and determination. The officers thought they could get away with it, but now he had the evidence he needed. He made a mental note to confront them again. But this time, it would be different. This time, he would have the facts on his side. The next day, James brought the evidence to his supervisor, Lieutenant Harris. He explained the situation, showing him the reports and the statements from other officers. Lieutenant Harris was shocked, but he didn't hesitate. "We need to handle this carefully," Harris said. "But you're right. We can't let them get away with this." James nodded. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes to stop them." Lieutenant Harris made some calls, and soon, a full investigation was underway. James knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. The officers would face consequences, and he was determined to make sure no one else would fall victim to their greed. As the investigation began, James could feel the weight of what was happening. He wasn't just helping to expose corruption. He was changing the way the department operated. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the future. Days passed, and the investigation into Collins and Richards grew more intense. James worked closely with Lieutenant Harris, ensuring that every piece of evidence was carefully reviewed. They knew that they had to get everything right. One mistake could let the officers slip through the cracks. James spent late nights at his desk, poring over files and reports. He had seen so many instances of corruption in the department, but this felt different. This wasn't just about catching two officers. It was about restoring integrity to the entire force. James was determined to make sure things changed. One afternoon, as James sat in his office, Lieutenant Harris knocked on the door. James looked up, and Harris stepped inside, his face serious. "It's time," Harris said, his voice calm but firm. James nodded, knowing exactly what that meant. Collins and Richards had been called in for questioning, and the moment of truth had arrived. The two officers had no idea that their past actions were about to catch up with them. James followed Harris to the interrogation room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, the weight of it was overwhelming. These were the men who had stolen from him, and now they would face the consequences of their greed. The door to the room opened, and Collins and Richards were led in by two other officers. They looked as confident as ever, but James could see the slightest flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. They still didn't know how much James had gathered. They still didn't know that their time was up. James stood at the back of the room, watching the scene unfold. Lieutenant Harris sat across from the officers, his voice steady as he began the questioning. "We've been reviewing your recent actions, and there are some serious concerns," Harris began. "You've been involved in several unauthorized stops, and we've gathered evidence of misconduct. We know about the money you took from that man a few weeks ago." Collins and Richards exchanged nervous glances, their confident masks starting to crack. James could see the realization hitting them. They were caught. "You don't have any proof," Collins said, trying to hold on to his composure. "This is just an accusation." But James stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "I have all the proof I need. The reports, the statements from other officers, the financial records, all of it points to you too. You've used your positions for personal gain, and now you're going to face the consequences." The room was silent for a moment as the weight of James' words sank in. Collins and Richards had nowhere to hide. They could no longer deny their actions. It was over. Harris leaned forward, his expression stern. "We'll be suspending you both pending a full investigation. You'll be placed under internal review, and you'll be given a chance to explain yourselves. But I think we both know how this will end." Collins and Richards sat in stunned silence, their heads hanging low. The arrogance they had once carried was gone, replaced by a sense of dread. They knew they were finished. As the two officers were led out of the room, James felt a sense of satisfaction. He had done it. They had been exposed for their wrongdoings, and now they would face the consequences. It was a moment of victory not just for him, but for the entire department. James had shown that justice could prevail, even when the odds seemed impossible. He had taken a stand, and now the department would be a better place because of it. James looked at Lieutenant Harris, who nodded at him with approval. "Good work, James," Harris said quietly. "You did the right thing." James smiled, knowing that the battle wasn't over yet. But today they had won, and that was enough for now. The next few days after Collins and Richards were suspended were filled with whispers and rumors around the department. Everyone knew that something had changed, but no one really knew the full details. James had made sure that the investigation remained confidential until everything was confirmed, but now that the officers were facing consequences, the truth started to spread. James walked through the halls of the department, and he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some looked at him with respect, others with curiosity. He knew that they were all wondering what would happen next. He wasn't just a new hire anymore. He was someone who had brought about real change, and it was clear that things would never be the same. At first, Collins and Richards fought back, trying to defend themselves. They denied everything, claiming that they were being unfairly targeted. But James had seen this kind of behavior before. People like Collins and Richards often tried to lie their way out of trouble. This time, though, they didn't have a way out. The evidence was undeniable. The stolen money, the suspicious reports, the statements from other officers, it all painted a clear picture of corruption. And it wasn't just a small mistake. Their actions had hurt people, taken advantage of their position, and undermined the trust the public had in the police. James knew that the department couldn't afford to ignore what had happened. Within a week, a full review of the department's practices was launched. James worked closely with Lieutenant Harris to ensure that the investigation into Collins and Richards was thorough. They needed to make sure that no one else in the department was involved in similar misconduct. James knew that this was just the beginning, but he also knew that it was necessary to rebuild the department's trust. It wasn't easy. Some of the officers felt betrayed by the investigation, and there were tense moments when they questioned whether they could trust each other. But James remained firm in his belief that honesty and integrity were the foundation of any good police department. If the officers wanted to be part of a team that truly served the public, they needed to hold themselves to a higher standard. The investigation into Collins and Richards eventually led to their termination. Both officers were formally charged with misconduct, and they were removed from the department. It was a decision that James had known was coming, but it still felt like a weight was lifted from his shoulders. He had done what he set out to do, and the department was one step closer to being a place where people could truly trust the officers who protected them. As the dust settled, James was approached by several of his colleagues. They thanked him for standing up for what was right and for bringing the truth to light. Some admitted that they had been afraid to speak out, but James had shown them that it was possible to make a difference, even in a place where corruption had taken root. James stood in the middle of the department, feeling a sense of pride. It wasn't about being praised. It was about knowing that he had made a real difference. The department was on its way to recovery, and he was a part of that change. But he knew this wasn't the end. There was still more work to be done. The road to rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy, but James was ready for whatever came next. He had learned that standing up for what's right was never easy, but it was always worth it. The department was slowly returning to normal, but James knew it would take time for everyone to heal. Collins and Richards were gone, but the ripple effects of their actions were still being felt. Many officers had lost trust in each other, and the department as a whole had a lot of rebuilding to do. But James was ready to take on the challenge. For the first time in a long while, James felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. He had always believed in fairness and justice, but now he could see how important those values were in the work he did. He wasn't just working for the city anymore. He was working to make the department a better place for everyone. James spent his days focusing on reforming the department. He worked closely with Lieutenant Harris, reviewing policies and making sure that transparency and accountability were at the heart of everything they did. There were still tough conversations, especially with officers who felt conflicted about the changes, but James knew this was the right path. He wasn't just changing the department for the better. He was making sure something like what happened with Collins and Richards would never happen again. The truth had come out, and the corrupt officers had been removed. But James knew that the work wasn't finished. He was determined to set an example, to show the rest of the department that it was possible to make a difference. He worked to build trust with the officers, encouraging them to be open and honest about the challenges they faced. He made it clear that the department was a place where integrity mattered, where doing the right thing wasn't just expected, it was the standard. One afternoon, as James walked through the department, he was stopped by Officer Davis, the veteran officer who had helped him with information about Collins and Richards. Davis smiled at James, a look of respect in his eyes. "You know, James," Davis said, "I didn't think much of you at first. But after everything that happened, I see you were just trying to do what's right. You've made a difference, and I respect that." James smiled back, grateful for the recognition. It wasn't about receiving praise, it was about knowing that he had done the right thing. The department was changing, and he was a part of that change. As the weeks went by, the department became stronger. The officers began to trust each other again, and the work that had once felt difficult now seemed more manageable. There were still obstacles to overcome, but James knew that he was part of something that was heading in the right direction. One evening, as James sat in his office, he reflected on everything that had happened. The stolen money, the investigation, and the eventual removal of Collins and Richards. It had all led to this moment. The department had come a long way, and James was proud of what he had helped accomplish. He knew that there was still a lot of work ahead, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful for the department, hopeful for the future, and most importantly, hopeful that things could change for the better. James had proven that standing up for what was right wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. And as he looked out of his office window, he knew that the hard work had just begun, but he was ready for whatever came next.